Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Salam alaikum. Peace be upon you. Come on, everybody. I know it's the afternoon. Salam alaikum. Welcome. Hello. Yeah, come on. Those of you who've been here all day, I admire your commitment. Those of you who've just arrived, welcome to the WISE Summit here in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be at the invitation of the organizers in such a great venue with such a great audience. This is the afternoon session entitled Understanding Extremist Recruitment and Early Intervention. My name is Mehdi Hasan. I'll be moderating this panel. We've got excellent 6 speakers here, all with their own expertise and their own styles. The plan, the format, we've got very limited time for 6 such excellent speakers, but the plan is that I'm going to kind of ask each one of them a question related to the topic, and they're going to give us their wisdom and brilliance, and I may follow up with a couple of questions if they don't mind. And if there's time at the end, we'll try and get some interaction between them, but I really do want to hear from each of them on their own specialist subjects, because we're in a city, Washington, D.C., where there are a lot of pundits, a lot of people with opinions, but not many people who know what they're talking about. So I think at events like this, let's try and stress that the people here know what they're talking about. I hope we'll discover very soon. Let's start with a woman who needs no introduction. You've seen her all day. Daisy Khan is here to my left. The founder, award-winning executive director of the Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, WISE. If you haven't heard of WISE, I'm not sure why you're here. But this is the WISE Summit. And Daisy, I want to just kick off straight in with a very obvious question that a lot of people want to know the answer to, not just in Washington, D.C., not just in government, but ordinary people across the West, across the Middle East, across the Muslim majority world, which is ISIS and their recruitment tactics. How is it that they recruit young people, kids, men, women? What is the role of online? What has your research taught you or shown you about how it is that they're so successful at recruiting very vulnerable, but often not vulnerable people as well?
Yeah. So in the earlier session, I did mention a little bit about the...
Yeah, what is...
There's a mic back there.
Can we ask people outside not to talk? And if you do want to talk, switch off the mic before you talk. Because you might say something you regret. Not that I've ever done that.
Okay.
Anyone? Daisy, just talk over them. Talk over them.
Okay. So I was just mentioning that in our research, we have identified that there are many discontents that people have, individuals have for various reasons. Some because people who really don't like to see the injustice in the world, and some people who really are, wanting meaning in life, and other people who are seeking to correct, or feel alienated and want to be accepted and have a sense of belonging to a sisterhood and brotherhood. So there are many discontents. And what Daesh does really well is that they actually have an offer for you on the other side. And there's an offer. Like, if you come here, your discontent will be taken care of. And it's like I mentioned earlier on the slide, women have specific discontents, but men also have their own discontents. So it's all in the book, and I don't want to go into that and waste too much time. But what Daesh does really well is they actually have a fairly well-crafted marketing machine. So they've taken Islam and manipulated it slightly so they can confuse people who don't know much about Islam, and then they market it really well. And then they have created a foundation, where they're actually showing the foundation of what is their foundation, which is rejectionist, exclusivist, apocalyptic narrative. All these kind of, their mind works in a very exclusivist way. That's also identified in the book, and it clearly shows you what their foundation of their thinking is. And then they take that and they turn that into like a step-by-step recruitment process, which we have in the back. If those of us who don't have a screen in the front, you'll turn around and you'll look at how they actually use step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and how they use certain religious terms to convince you that you are on the right path. Because they want to convince people, and religion is a huge mobilizing force for people. So this is what we have, but more important than that, it's really important to understand that they are recruiting millennials who understand this, Twitter character 148. I mean, if you look at this slide, look at this. This is amazing. They actually have something for all the people out there. If you want to have a party, there are selfies. If you want justice, there's justice. If you want love, there are kittens everywhere. If you're looking for a male soldier valor, you got that too. If you're into women's empowerment, they have jobs for women. They actually tell you you can be of service to the nation. They are lions. They're very territorial. They provide health services because they're kind and merciful. If you die a martyr, there's a beautiful halo on your head, and with Ray-Ban glasses, by the way, it's very attractive. I mean, if you're looking for religious instruction, if you're into Hollywood films, they have beautiful video production, hashtags, speeches, self-publishing material. It's a marketing machine. It's a corporation. It's not a terrorist group. This is another way of life, a vision that they created for many people, and they offer this vision in a very slick, highly marketed way. And we're living in a world where you can market anything, and so it's very effective marketing, and that's why we need to show people this so that people do not accidentally get recruited into this. As I mentioned earlier, this young girl who was recruited by this machine, this online machine, and we need parents to be aware of this and community leaders to become aware of this.
We are here, Daisy, in Washington, D.C., where there's a great obsession with the Islamic part of ISIS, let's be clear, for the last few years. That's been one of the big focuses. You mentioned that religion is a great mobilizing force, how religious versus terminology is used to recruit. When you hear people say this is a religious war, this is about this is about taking on board a perverted or distorted or whatever form of Islam, but it's still Islam. What's your response based on the kind of research that you've done, based on all these kind of steps? How much, as part of that big package, how much of it is religion?
A lot of it, unfortunately, but it is not. In other words, religious concepts are used and manipulated, and they're manipulated slightly. So in the earlier session that we had, we actually showed a slide of a pyramid that is built around these concepts, like martyrdom and shaheed and kafir and all these al-wala wal-bara, these terms that are common to Muslims. And if you are not very religious, you can get very confused by that. So yes, they are using religion, and that's why we need people like Omar Suleiman. We need our community leaders and our sheikhs and our imams to take few moments and read this 365-page, 75-page book and say, okay, I got it. Now I know how it works. And they can then help the young people and create resiliency within the community.
So you mentioned him. Let's bring him in. Shaykh Omar Suleiman, we have an actual imam sitting here who's also president of the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He's a professor of Islamic Studies at Southern Methodist University. How much do you think religion plays a role in this extremist recruitment, especially at early ages, especially with the younger recruits?
Well, I mean, I find that religion is often the disguising language of these essentially political grievances. And so I think that, from my perspective, and though I have to walk a fine line from an Islamic perspective, what we do what we try to do with our research is obviously try to make sure that we're not just rescuing Islamic text from extremists. We're contextualizing. We are offering, a mainstream interpretation of text. We don't want young Muslims to be introduced to Islamic text for the first time through any agenda-driven group, through Islamophobes or through extremists and things of that sort. But I do think they're essentially political grievances, and I think that it's important for people to step up and to speak to those political grievances as well, and to not shy away from them. And it's very difficult when, if the same voice that is being used to speak against extremism is silent on state-sanctioned terror or on war or legitimate political grievances, that voice is automatically discredited. So if it's funded, by a government in the Middle East that is criminalizing all political opposition, then it's not going to be a legitimate voice on extremism or terrorism or those political grievances. It's not going to reach its target audience. So we have to create space where we can honestly and openly address both the root causes as well as the symptoms, as well as the languaging, as well as the soil that becomes fertile for that type of languaging. And that takes a comprehensive approach that is not, I think that extremism, is obviously one of the issues, and it's the core issue of the discussion here in the panel. building a strong Muslim identity and a strong American Muslim identity that's comfortable with his or her Islam, comfortable with the texts, comfortable, can fully express themselves within their text, can fully feel empowered in addressing legitimate grievances and then finding legitimate Islamic solutions to those grievances. So I think that that credibility is extremely important here, and that we cannot restrict it to ideology alone.
And just on, you talk about building identities. Number one, what responsibility do communities and community leaders have for building those identities? And number two, something I want to inject in discussion, I know you've written about it and talked about it recently, which is what is the responsibility that, for example, tech companies have when it comes to talking about some of this stuff? Because, of course, we know there's a lot of hate out there. Community leaders, imams can do as much as they can to deal with that. But in the unregulated spaces, a lot of people aren't going to mosques to be radicalized. In fact, the mosque seems to be one of the rarest places where people end up getting radicalized these days. It's elsewhere. How do we tackle that?
Well, I think that we have to, just as when we're talking about Islamophobia, we have to challenge it in the spaces where it's festering and being made prominent. We also have to challenge all, all deviant ideologies in their spaces. So we do have to take it to the internet. We do have to offer a voice that is authentic, that is intellectually free, that is politically independent, that is able to address root causes. Now, I will say this, that a lot of times, if someone comes to an imam, and I think we underestimate what role the imam can play in shaping that character, because character is not going to be shaped online. I mean, character will be built and shaped often within those mosques and within these places. I think that building a certain level of trust, creating that dialogue and that room for dialogue over those things is very important, while still not shying away from the internet. So it's obviously multifaceted, and our response, just as extremism is multifaceted and it's very comprehensive, our response also has to be multifaceted, and we cannot discount one area of that response, of that comprehensive response. So it all has to work. We all have to work together in that.
Okay, so on that note, let me bring in Scott Cooper, who's a former Marine who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, currently serves as Director of National Security Outreach for Human Rights First, which is an international human rights group. Scott, hating others, demonizing others, dehumanizing others seems to be the common thread when it comes to looking at extremist recruitment, extremist groups, extremist ideology. How do you counter, in an age of social media, in an age of everyone spending all of their lives online, how do you counter that hate speech and that demonization, which often goes hand in hand with radicalization?
Oh, certainly. Thanks for that question, Daisy. Thanks for the invitation here. It's an honor to be here. I think part of it starts by wanting to put people into a broad brush category. So if I were to tell you that I'm a Marine, you automatically assume a couple of things. Either one, I'm broken, or two, I'm a comic book hero. I'm neither one. If I talk about a young man who happens to be a Muslim, whether he lives in the Middle East or in America, we want to paint that broad brush stroke, that stereotype that's unfair. I think the first thing that you do, and this is based on the research of Rachel Brown, who's done some remarkable work. She spent about 4 years in Kenya doing exactly this. How do you counter hate speech? And then came and spent a year on a fellowship at the Holocaust Memorial. So I encourage you to read her guide as well. You have to start by identifying with an individual. Someone who's spewing hate speech perhaps has a grievance that they want to air. And so just arguing with them, as we are wont to do today on the internet and on cable television, is not productive. You have to figure out how to meet them where they are. I'll give you one quick example, and then we can go on. Starbucks has a wonderful series called this Upstanders Challenge. And there's a young lady in Missoula, Montana, who established a project to welcome refugees. And this is the perfect case in point, because there's a part in the video where she meets with this old guy that was at a town council meeting talking about how we don't want them here. We don't want any of those Muslims here. And you fast forward in the video, it's about 7 minutes long, and she has breakfast with him. And he says, I don't change my beliefs very often. He's well into his 70s. But he says, those kids next door, they're just the cutest things. Part of it happens through storytelling, through not painting people in a broad brush. I hope you'll think I'm a comic book hero. I'm not. And similarly, as you look at others, even those perhaps that are spewing that hate speech, meet them where they are, build a relationship, and take it down to an individual level.
What do you say in, for example, in Muslim communities who are pushing back against a lot of the far-right extremism we're seeing now, a lot of the Islamophobia that we're seeing in the United States? I often give talks on university campuses to organizations, and I make the point about identifying with each other, building relationships. Facts and figures don't change people's minds, right? Relationships do. But the counter to that, people would say, well, there's not enough of us. The Muslim population of America, for example, is what, 1%, 2% of the population. At the end of the day, how do you practically put that in action when the numbers are so insurmountable on one side? For example, if you're looking at it purely from the perspective of, say, anti-Muslim hatred.
I think that gets to a lot of what our work is. I work at Human Rights First, and we have an initiative called Veterans for American Ideals. We're also in the 1% category, those who serve in the military. Although we have about 8% of the population that are, in fact, veterans. Build broad coalitions. When do you find the opportunity, like in this room today, where we have Jews, Christians, Muslims together in that? So it's not as though the Muslim community is alone. How do they reach out? That's among the things we're doing with our veterans around the country. Go find a mosque, meet them where they are, and build a broad coalition. Have a conversation. Find something to do. And we've found a lot of times that's through service projects. If you're helping clean up a park, paint a school, helping homeless people, that's a way to build these coalitions that debunk those stereotypes, and then you're actually contributing to your communities.
Sami Rangel is the co-founder and executive director of Life After Hate, a 501c3 US nonprofit created in 2011 by former members of the American violent far-right extremist movement, which now aims to inspire, educate, guide, and counsel. Sami's part autobiography, part manual is called Forebears, The Myths of Forgiveness, launched in Ireland in 2011 at the Summit Against Violent Extremism. Sami, you work with far-right extremists or people who want to leave that world. What is their psychological makeup? We hear so much about Muslim extremists, but post-Charlottesville, people are waking up to the idea that actually there are some extremists in the United States who aren't Muslim. Is it similar, the makeup, the psychological makeup? Daisy mentioned some of the kind of vulnerabilities and some of the kind of people who are attracted to it. Is it similar on the far right?
I think our board president, Tony Mack, is here with us too, and I think he would agree with me that what we're hearing up here and what we've been hearing throughout the day is almost word for word what we're finding through our work here dealing with domestic terrorism. Listening today, I think that it's also important, just to take a small segue, is to recognize that WISE is an organization of women. And I think we need to honor that right now. And it's for the men to get behind those issues, because we are responsible for the vast amount of violence in this country towards men and towards women. And so I think it's important to lend our strength and our position if they'll have us at the table anytime they allow us to. So Daisy, hats off to you and your organization for that. Secondly, we talked about these issues kind of from an old paradigm of left, right, and middle. And I know in my family, you're talking about storytelling as what we would call oral tradition. I think we have to move in a circular fashion, and so we have to align ourselves in a position to wrap around all those sides, to encircle all of these paradigms and try to insert a narrative, much like the ones that we're hearing today, with compassion, empathy, getting to know people. We're being asked more than ever a question that is pointing to, I think, an unasked question. People are asking, what are we supposed to do when these violent extremists visit our community, visit our college? I find that question to hint at the fact that we are also questioning our own resolve, that the actions of these events that are rooted in hate and fear and ignorance and phobias of various types are making us question our own moral platforms, our own moral character, our moral identity. And I think at the beginning, middle, and end of all the conversations I'm having, I am simply encouraging people to maintain what they would perceive as their moral high ground. Like, don't surrender your character. Don't surrender what makes you true to yourself, no matter what you're facing. And so while we're trying to create all these paradigms on how to intervene, we also need to be encouraging our community to stay true to what makes them who they are. In many ways, what we're seeing in far-right issues are issues related coming out of the last 50 years of civil rights, the civil rights movement. And because of that, there is a population who is used to privilege, who has been forced in many ways by these policies to have to share things that they were not willing to share. And so they were dragged kicking and screaming into the civil rights era, and now they want to fight back. And while we're addressing those grievances, which even from my perspective may not seem legitimate, we can't just discount their experience. Their experience is legitimate to them, and that's what we need to validate. And just like we need to be validated in our perspective, and that validation isn't co-signing that, and I think that's a misnomer, right? We're not saying that we concede or that we reject. We're simply listening, and I think that goes a long way to create the bridges and dismantle the barriers that exist between what we would say is our side versus their side.
You mentioned sides. You reminded me of your organization was in the news recently because you lost funding from the current administration. Some would say that's a sign that a lot of people in Washington, D.C., a lot of people in power still aren't willing to recognize that extremism doesn't have a religion or a race. It can affect all communities. Are you pessimistic about how many people in power and influence are taking seriously the idea that extremism is not just a brown Muslim thing?
I'm not pessimistic about anything, and I don't think anyone attending a conference like this can afford to be. We are inserting hope into hopeless situations all the time. Our organization is comprised of men and women who were once condemned, and maybe rightfully so, but who have shown that with the right systems and supports in place, and with the right will and desire from within, that not only can we reconcile, but we can be redeemed. And so that message alone, an organization who started from their own pockets, the lint in their pockets, and has maintained, whether we've had funding or not from this administration, our mission continues forward. Not only did we lose the funding, which in many ways was the onset of the next phase of life after hate, this nation rallied behind us after Charlottesville when they connected the dots between the loss of funding and what Charlottesville represented for this nation, and they helped us raise $500,000 within like a 2-week period.
Wow. And let me just, since you mentioned, let me just ask one last question before we move on. What was when you watched those images out of Charlottesville, the people shouting, "Jews will not replace us," the torches, etc., what was your instant reaction when you switched on the news or on YouTube that day? How did you react?
Well, when we came back from the Summit Against Violent Extremism in Ireland in 2011, we knew that we were pioneering in many ways a practice that has no experts and has no theory behind it just yet. It's starting to manifest itself. The second thing is that my team has always told me that the results that we see today in America were all through the fruits of their labor as white supremacists in the 70s and the 80s. So they're now, these groups that put out these missions of hate are now kind of benefiting from the propaganda that they have put out then, now. The third thing that my partners have taught us all is that those things are not one-offs. This has been the norm behind the scenes, but it's just now being forced into dialogues around coffee, around breaks at work, and now on national platforms by this country. People have to talk about it now. They can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
And just to be clear, are these white supremacist hate groups? Daisy outlined how media savvy and how online savvy the ISIS and its ilk are. Are there white far-right equivalents equally adept online when it comes to recruitment and propaganda?
When I was listening to Tony talk at a synagogue in Canada, he said that what used to take years is now taking weeks and months in the radicalization process, and that is a direct result of what social media and the internet has been able to provide these hate groups.
Okay. Well, on that note, let me bring in Dr. Katarzyna Jasko, who's a postdoctoral research fellow working in the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. Research focuses on political radicalization. She also works with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. I just want to ask you about, just picking up the same subject, when you look at the mindset, obviously there's no single profile for someone who becomes an extremist or terrorist. When you look at some of the risk factors, when you look at some of the personality types of people who either join a far-right group or join a quote-unquote jihadist group, are they similar? Is it kind of two sides of the same coin, or is that too simplistic?
There you are.
Keep talking.
Hello?
Yeah.
No? Yeah? Okay. First, I would like to thank you for invitation to this panel and to this event. It's really great to be here. Related to your question, so I'm a social psychologist, and in our lab we're trying to understand what makes extremism appealing to people, and we try to study different types of extremism, far right, far left, religiously motivated, and we are particularly interested in how psychological needs to belong, to be member of a valued group, to have meaningful life, to be successful in professional life, how those needs and frustrations of those needs are related to endorsement of violent extremism and supports for violent extremism. And I think one study that is relevant to this question that we did recently, we looked at archival data on 1,500 extremists, basically individuals who radicalized in the United States to the point of committing an illegal act, and some of those people were engaged in violent acts, and some of those people were involved in illegal but non-violent acts, and we're interested in like what distinguishes those who committed violence from those who committed non-violent acts. And those individuals represented different causes. They were far right, far left, but also Islamist extremists. And what we found is that similar factors contributed to engagement in violence across the whole ideological spectrum. So basically people who experience problems in their relationships, who experience failures in their professional lives, who experience abuse, they were more likely to engage in violent acts, regardless of whether they were committed for a religiously motivated cause or far right or far left cause. Another finding that was pretty similar across the ideological spectrum, and I think it also speaks to the radicalization process and the recruitment process, is that one factor that was very important for whether individual committed violent or non-violent act was whether they had a friend who was already radicalized. And that was true for far right and religiously motivated violence. So I understand that online propaganda and online recruitment is very important, but also I think this immediate close relationships are very important in radicalization. Another study that was done by my colleague David Weber on members of, actually former members of neo-Nazi groups in Germany, and he also found that similar factors such as lack of meaningful social relationships, but also having close connections to radicalized in others were crucial for those people to get involved in neo-Nazi groups.
So it's interesting because at one time the debate on the left used to be it's all about foreign policy. That's why people get radicalized. And on the right, it used to be, or still is, it's all about religion, Islam, these bunch of people with their weird ideology. But now a lot of the experts like yourself are saying it's much broader than that. It's kind of personality factors. People talk about identity crises. When you have these kind of not discrete factors, not as easy to say, oh, it's all the fault of the Iraq War, or it's all the fault of Islam. But it's much harder when you say it's to do with people's lack of relationships, unhappiness at work, vulnerability. How do you tackle it? How do you come up with a solution or a strategy then when it's so disparate and widespread? You can't really come up with an anti-terror strategy which deals with people's lack of good relationships in their lives. Is there a way has any of your research shown how you then push back against some of these factors?
I mean, I will not pretend that I know the solution to extremism. Like, I wish I could offer a solution. I would say that, like in our perspective, we try to identify those common themes, common motivations, common needs that people feel are neglected and that pushes them towards extremism. So of course we cannot find everyone like a meaningful relationships, but some of those frustrated needs are actually collective. So people feel that their groups are disrespected, and this is something that could be addressed with policies, and we know that could be also frustrated with policies. So I think some of those needs can be addressed on like more collective level.
And obviously you're a psychologist looking at this from the perspective of a psychologist. A lot of people, when they look at, you know, the Omar Mateens of the world in Orlando or whatever it is, these kind of people who become iconic, violent men, terrorists, and they say, look, they're messed up in the head. They're just messed up in the head. You can't do anything about it. These people are mentally unbalanced. They have psychological issues. They've had childhood traumas. But then there's others who come along and say, well, actually, the data doesn't show that. Actually, terrorists are very well-adjusted, well-educated professionals, et cetera, et cetera. Again, where do you stand on that part of the spectrum? How much should we look at the role that mental health problems play in some of these issues?
So yeah, as you said, like at some point in the research on terrorism, it was the main idea was that terrorists are just like mentally imbalanced people. And that was, the evidence shows that that's not the case. Of course, it doesn't mean that mentally imbalanced people cannot become terrorists or cannot become extremists. And that's a factor that can contribute to, for example, lack of meaningful relationships. It's much more difficult to have such relationships or be successful in life and in professional life. So that can contribute, but that's not the only factor that accounts for becoming an extremist.
But even if they're not mentally ill, just to go back to your first answer, a lot of these people, especially in Europe, it seems to me, seem to be people who are generally miserable with their lives or with their life situation. You look at some of the people, the European quote-unquote jihadists in particular, seem to be the people on the fringes of society, people who've got messed up childhoods, the Kouachi brothers who are from broken homes and orphanages. That does seem to be a kind of common fact in Europe, at least.
Yeah, I would say that those things that you mentioned definitely contribute to the frustration of those needs that I said earlier are a factor in extremism.
Daisy?
I just wanted to add to that the brief conversation that I had with a young lady who's in prison. I started with, because I had read my manual, like how do you rehabilitate someone? I said, tell me everything about your life. When were you born and how did you land here? I want to know everything about it. And so she's not mentally, she has no mental health issues, but she has human needs, which of course Surya talks about. Humans have needs, children have needs. And if certain sets of needs are not met, then they will resort to wherever those needs are met. So her thing was, my needs are not being met. I have basic needs. I need to fulfill these needs.
Extremist groups are willing to try and meet those needs
And
in their own
by the way,
perverted
they are
way.
offering me everything that I need. So.
Daisy's really good at introducing the next speaker who comes after every time. So Soraya Dean is here. To my right, the founder of the Muslim Women Speakers Movement, author of Peace Matters, Raising Peace-Conscious Children. Your contribution to the book is a parenting guide, and we talk about kind of, Katarzyna was talking about young people and vulnerabilities and people who are not happy with their life and lacking meaningful relationships. What role, therefore, can parents play? So often we hear when we see a story about a terrorist attack, immediately the question is, well, what was the family life like? What was the spouse like? If they're young people, we say, did the parents know what was going on? What role can parents play, if any, in pushing back against some of the recruitment that we're talking about?
Arms here. Thank you. How many mothers? How many fathers? How many not sure? So,
on the way.
Parenting, I'm a parent myself, Before I had 2 children, I had 2 theories to raise children. Now I have 2 children, I have no theories. It's a tough job. This is the only job you're told come without experience. And what we do is we learn on the job. And there's so much that we need to do. It's not that we lack the will. We love our kids, but we lack the skill. So when was the last time somebody, we are much older here, but a young to-be mother, has anybody told you take a class in parenting? If I had a choice, I would legislate for that, because it is very critical, because this is a sacred job. This is a sacred job, because when our children are born, only 25% of their brain is developed. So we, parents, we are sculptors. And children become who they experience. Lots of parents, when I have my classes, they say, oh my God, but I did the best. Yes, you did the best, but what did the other parent do? Because we, in our homes, we have bi-paradigms in parenting. We have parents who are transactional and authoritarian. We have parents who are transformational, and there's the bi-paradigm. So for us to understand which paradigm are we coming from is very critical. Very critical. That's where the journey begins. It's a soul-searching question, and I do that every day. I have 2 kids, but I still keep doing it because I falter, but I get up with a new vigor, with new knowledge, and with new energy. So what can we do? Many things. But I would say begin with the awareness that your child is is a gift to you. It's a gift to you. I think it was Rabindranath Tagore who said, every child who's born is a reminder that God has not given up on humanity. So let us not give up on our children. When is the last time that we went in the morning to see our child in his bedroom or her bedroom and smile with the child, particularly when we had a hard time with the child the day before? How many of us carry forward? So be very mindful in the way you parent, and realize that you have a title. Your child can't fire you. So you need to learn on the job, continue to become a better parent. And then remember, communication is very, very critical. That is my deep expertise, nonviolent communication. In nonviolent communication, we learn to make observations. Instead of judging, evaluating, blaming, and shaming your child, we learn to make observations. So let's say, for instance, your child said, Mom, I had an A in this class, but you look at the report card and he has had a B. It might be your immediate instant reaction to say, hey, you have lied. But here's what nonviolent parenting does. You take a step back and you tell your child, hey, you said you had an A, but you have a B. That's making a clear observation. And then we enter into a conversation expressing, I'm feeling sad, disappointed, and making our needs and feelings felt. So that's a whole different class. And then also remember, I want to give you hope, because I'm not a perfect parent. There is no perfect parent. I think we have perfect moments in parenting. What we all can do is we can repair the rupture. We can repair the rupture, offer a lot of empathy, begin the conversation. Mom is feeling very sad that this happened. What do you have to say about it? Because there is sufficient proof to say that children who are raised in authoritarian homes, children are raised violently, have a more stronger tendency to commit violence.
Yeah, Shaykh Omar.
One of the things that I've heard in the last three speakers is I think we underestimate how crippling isolation is, and the fear of loneliness, and just what a person who's going through that type of isolation is exposed to online. So the sense of belonging, more than someone who's mentally demented or who's unstable, I mean, that sense of belonging needs to be very strong. So that's why it kind of goes back to the construction of that identity and not leaving our youth prey to that. I've seen many times where, if a young man, and if we're going to fight exclusionary rhetoric and exclusionary behavior and exclusionary interpretation, we can't push back with exclusionary interpretation and exclusionary rhetoric and then push people out from this way and then leave them out to dry because they have grievances or they have opinions. That sense of belonging needs to be nurtured. Interestingly enough, in my own personal experience, when it came to ISIS, when I made it on the glorified assassination list of ISIS, it wasn't actually one of my refutations of ISIS. I was kind of offended. It wasn't one of the things I said about ISIS. It was a video that we made about our work in the multi-faith community. We have Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, which is a multi-faith coalition for peace and justice. And it was a video called An Imam, a Pastor, and a Dream. And it was basically the message of the video was that we can love each other and we can cooperate with each other while still being in the fullness of our tradition, while being fully Muslim, fully Christian. I don't have to leave my identity at the door to work with you and to help foster and create that harmonious society. That's my phone. It's all good. It's not the mic. So, and that ended up being what caught the attention of ISIS, because I think that if we can construct that strong identity and foster that sense of belonging with opinions, with your grievances, then we can really do a lot more in pushing back on all of these forms of rhetoric.
So let me ask Daisy a question. You've put together this summit, you put together this book, you're involved in this field. 3 of the previous 4 speakers have specifically gone out of their way to say hope, the importance of hope, not pessimistic, says Sami. When you look at the ISIS recruitment strategies, you pointed out how media savvy, how slick they are. You call them a corporation. Now terrorism experts are saying with the fall of Raqqa and Mosul and their military defeats in the Middle East, we're actually going to see an upsurge in terrorist attacks as they try and show their relevance. Are you an optimist or a pessimist in the short term, at least when it comes to pushing back against these guys?
I mean, maybe 3 years ago I would have been a pessimist because I didn't know what was a way forward. I now know, I have a lot more knowledge about how they operate and what they do and their tactics and their modus operandi. And I think we're ready because, this whole toolkit has been created specifically for that reason. And I'm so excited to have met this young lady because she's giving us valuable information on how this whole thing operates. And she's going to work with us and we're going to, continue to use her as a champion against this cause. So in some ways, those people who are disaffected are the very people that we need to bring in, but we need to bring them in such a way that, we're not using them as a tool, but really reform them and turn them into advocates against them. So I think that if we do it gradually and we do it in such a way that, like for instance, this young girl, I told her, I said, her mother has just passed away, so she's motherless. She has, her father's like non-existent, and she needs a parent. She needs a family. And I in some bizarre way, I don't know how I got connected, and through this book, I got connected to her. She needs me. She's 22 years old. She needs a mentor. She needs somebody who's going to guide her in the future. I've committed to doing that with her. I said, I am your mother in disguise now. I don't have a child of my own, and I'm willing to be your mother. And I can never replace your mother, but your mother would never want you to be in this position. And you don't have to go to Thanksgiving by yourself. You don't have to not have a family. My family will be your family. Of course, and she needs a lot of help, because once she comes out, there are all these issues with incarcerated people. But I'm willing to do that for her, because I know that's the big gap in her, and make her whole again.
Let me ask Soraya, you talk about the importance of the role that parents can play, which I don't think anyone would dispute. A lot of parents, especially Muslim parents, might hear you speak and say, everything you say is true. Those are the kind of things we should be doing with our kids, the basic stuff in terms of love, compassion. But they might recoil from the idea of saying, look, I'm a parent. My job is to bring up the best child I can, give them love, etc. It's not my job to be part of some anti-extremism or counter-terrorism campaign. I don't want to be co-opted into a political strategy or a national security strategy. I just want to be a parent. What would you say to them?
Absolutely be a parent. Because what is wrong with the world is we want to fix everything. We little realize the only person we can fix is ourselves. So as parents, we are very busy teaching and telling, but we forget they are watching. So what needs to upset us more is, am I modeling love? I can disagree with my child, but I have to not be disagreeable. So these are little things that parents have to really stand up and don't talk about extremism. It might not even come to that for you, because have that relationship with your child. And here's what the Prophet clearly said. He said to the men, the best gift you can give your child is to love the mother of that child. So we don't need to go beyond that to understand what a duty, what a sacred duty this is.
Sami, I just want to ask about this whole debate, which I touched on. You must hear Muslim communities get really upset about always having to condemn terrorism. There's always a debate about, this recruitment's happening in your communities. What are you doing about it? What actions are you taking? There's always a kind of externally imposed expectation, question, demand to do something about it. I'm just wondering, given we talked earlier, you've worked with white far-right extremists. We talked about Charlottesville. Is there now an equivalent debate that needs to be happening in the mainstream American society, the white majority, the conservative white majority even? Is that fair for Muslims to push back and say, well, where's the debate on the other side about what the wider community should be doing to stop extremist recruitment on the far right side?
I think any of the topics are fair and should be on the table, right? When you're brainstorming solutions, I don't think you should have any bad ideas that you just immediately dismiss. We were being asked to denounce all kinds of things when Charlottesville happened, and I stood firm and I said, we're actually going to identify who we stand with at this point. We wanted to rally around the troops. We wanted to bear witness to the causes that people were picking up, honor that life that was lost in that incident, but also, like we've heard as a narrative here, not adopt the values of the people that were responsible for that violence, but to create an exit for them, because we know that after these acts of violence, many of them start to question their membership because it became so extreme. It's one thing to talk about it, and it's another to actually be forced into that action, and so a lot of them want a way out.
Has there been evidence of exit since August?
Absolutely. I mean, almost immediately, and including people who were close to some of the main characters that were playing a part in that. And we've also seen an upsurge in family members now realizing that they can reach out on behalf of the loved ones that they have, which was something that we hadn't seen in the numbers that we're seeing now.
Scott, do you want to pick up on that?
One of the concerns I have is that it's not productive to point out the other person's hypocrisy.
But it's fun sometimes.
It is fun. It is fun. I read my daughter's Facebook. And so I applaud what Sammy's doing. The most productive thing that can happen after Charlottesville is that maybe some relationships are built. Are you legitimized in saying, how dare you accuse me when you're doing exactly this kind of behavior? There's something about the plank in your own eye. I'm not sure what the verse is, right? But again, I would submit that the most productive thing that can come out of these kinds of episodes is not pointing out the other's hypocrisy, but again, back to building a relationship, creating a narrative that is a profoundly different narrative than what they're advocating.
But just to be devil's advocate on this, in terms of the hypocrisy, clearly there's no real value, apart from the fun value of pointing out the hypocrisy of someone on this issue. But from a purely anti-extremism perspective, you could argue that one of the best ways to try and convince, I don't know, an angry, disillusioned, marginalized young Muslim man in some Western city who's thinking about, rebelling against his parents or community by going and joining extremism, to point out that actually the societies in which you live, the government that represents you, does treat people equally, does treat extremism and hate in a fair manner. Because I think there is a lot of sense, I think the double standards argument has been used by a lot of people as a kind of quote-unquote justification for whatever evil acts they decide to do. Well, why shouldn't I when the government treats us like this, when the government does this? So I think if the government, whichever country in the West, were to have a more equal approach to radicalization, recruitment, funding groups that fight that actually might make the entire approach more credible.
I think you've got a great point. What you just said there reminded me of a lot of conversations I had with young youth in Iraq when I was there over the course of several tours. As we tried to rehabilitate, because we had 30,000 young men imprisoned in Iraq that are no longer imprisoned. How do you rehabilitate? Partly it's not arguing about justice, but trying to get them to be part of the solution. This is your country. This is our country, where we are today. Citizenship is not a spectator sport. How do you convince them, whether it was someone using a Home Depot tiki torch, looking all silly in Charlottesville, to a far-right extremist that might commit acts that SEMI works to stop, or a young Muslim youth? How do you turn them to be part of the solution and being part of their community rather than being isolated, like Suleiman mentioned?
Just one of the natural responses that I get, because I'm one of those guys that points out the hypocrisy all the time.
I made a career out of it.
One of the responses is, so you're saying Islam is a hateful ideology like white supremacy. And I think that going back to the identity crisis, I think we need to point out that no, Islam has inspired over 1 billion people towards good, gave birth to civilization in many ways as we know it. What good has white supremacy brought to this world except for evil and hatred and havoc? So I think that when we push back on the hypocrisy, we say, look, even putting those two in the same bucket and saying, well, okay, we're going to start treating all forms of extremism and hatred
but
the
your
same way.
savvier opponent would say it's not Islam and white supremacy I'm comparing, it's white supremacy and Salafi jihadism, Islamism, takfir, whatever word you want to use to call the ideology. That's what would be the comparison, that there's these perverted ideologies on both sides.
Well, one's a core idea, because there's no less graduated form of white supremacy that should be acceptable, whereas these ideologies that you're mentioning are perverted ideologies and deviations from what is essentially good and foundationally good. And so that's why we go back to what's good at the foundation. Whereas when it comes to white supremacy, can we stop calling it white nationalism? We got to cut it out from the very beginning and say that this will inevitably graduate into something that's evil and perverted because its root is perverted and
Interesting. Katarzyna, Scott mentioned rehabilitation. And I was just thinking, in the UK right now, they're having a big debate about what to do with ISIS fighters who return to the UK, young men who have gone out to fight. And one Foreign Office minister said the only solution is to kill them, is what he said last week, Rory Stewart. In Denmark...
Psychology disagrees.
Sorry?
Psychology disagrees with this.
Okay. In Denmark, they have this Aarhus program that people have talked about in terms of de-radicalizing Danish foreign fighters who've come back home, and they claim some success. In countries like Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, they all have their own kind of non-name brand de-radicalization programs. From your research, is there a model, is there a program that you can point to that's been successful when we talk about recruitment, but what about the exit ramps that Sami and Scott have referred to?
I mean, one thing is that it's really difficult to study the radicalization programs because first, there are not that many of them, and second of all, it's like really difficult to study. Yeah. However, in our lab, there's one study done on the radicalization program in Sri Lanka, where the program involved addressing needs and frustrated needs, and from the evidence collected within this research, it seemed to be successful, that the extent to which the program addressed the frustrated needs at the beginning, it was related to reduced extremism at the end of the program. So this is the evidence that I know. As I said, it's really difficult to study, but that would suggest that if we try to reverse the process of radicalization, it should lead to reduced extremism.
Okay, Daisy.
So, Religious Rehabilitation Center in Singapore is where all of this work began. In our book, we have mentioned how they were the basis of discovering what this ideology was. Right after 9/11 in Singapore, there was supposed to be a 4-target terrorist attack. I think 1 attack happened, but they weren't successful, and 3 attacks were prevented. And the Singapore government was really worried. I mean, what is Singapore? It's just a tiny little business, country. And the government didn't know what to do because it was Jamaat Islamiyah who had carried this out. So they went to the local religious leaders and they said, why are Muslims doing this? And the religious leaders said, you're framing them, it cannot be Muslims. And so the government went back and pleaded with the people, said, please tell us why this would happen. We're a tiny little country, we're going to get destroyed. And finally, the ulama had to come together. And once they came together, they said, we will interview the people ourselves to determine whether they did it and who they are and what their thinking is. And so I think 5 ulama were assigned to go into the prisons. They went to the prisons and they spoke to the people there. And they came back and reported to their own community that not only are these people a danger to Singapore, they're actually a danger to the Muslim community itself. Because what they are saying is in none of our books. It's in none of our texts. It's such deviated, understanding. Anyway, they began to do the rehabilitation of these people who were in prisons, and it's considered to be one of the most successful program where you rehabilitate people, because so that people can go back and become citizens again. So these people, it's all anonymous. They put them out there. Nobody knows they were former extremists. It's beautifully done. It's done with, in fact, we have a section in the book of how to rehabilitate people using religious vernacular. So there is a successful program, which, by the way, was replicated by the Sri Lankans, then was replicated by the Saudis, and many people are trying to replicate it for the local context.
And if it was replicated in the United States, Omar, would you agree to be part of that? If somebody came to you and said, we'd like you to be one of the scholars to be part of a US government de-radicalization program?
No, it's not US. So in this case, the Singaporeans did not really, the government was not involved. So that's why the religious leaders said, we want full access. We want to do this independently of you.
So what's your response when you as Imam hear about these programs? How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, look, I have to view, I think you have to always look at what's behind the rehabilitation. If the goal of rehabilitation is, which in the case of I'm highly skeptical of Saudi Arabia's rehabilitation program and some of the other rehabilitation programs that are out there.
It's not successful because a lot of people, they pay people a lot of money. So once they're...
The Saudis pay their way out of a problem? Well, wow.
So
you're not listening, Saudi Arabia, right?
No, so I think that, again, so this sort of goes back to the original point that I made. If we're going to really speak to the beauty of our faith tradition in a way that it cannot be exploited and hijacked, then we need to have full reign and independence to be able to do that without any strings attached, without any malicious agenda behind that. And so when I saw I'm sorry, we already said Saudi Arabia, but it's beyond Saudi Arabia. When I see, the Crown Prince or whoever it may be, or, talking about we're going to return to a moderate form of Islam, what does that mean? So I'm skeptical. We'll wait to see, and we'll continue to push. But I'm skeptical in general of these rehabilitation programs. If we're given independence, if we're given the ability to provide a wholesome understanding of our faith, I think that's beautiful, and that's something that we should all strive to do.
We're running out of time. I want to ask one question to you all. to try and take a stab at, which is we're in Washington, D.C. This is a summit talking about trying to solutions and a way forward. If the President of the United States, not just this president, but any president of the United States, and some of you might not want to speak to this president, but if a president of the United States were to ring you up tomorrow morning and say, what's the one thing that I could do that I'm not doing, that the government could do that they're not doing, to try and nip some of these recruitment problems and radicalization problems in the bud, what would it be? What would you advise? Scott, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Do the exact thing that George W. Bush did after 9/11, in which he went to a mosque and gave a tremendous speech. It's a speech worth seeing again.
When he went to mosque in D.C. and said Islam is not a religion of violence.
Exactly.
I was worried that he said do the same thing that George Bush did after 9/11. Like, which
No,
one?
no.
He did so many things. I wasn't sure what, but you went for the one good thing he did. Okay. Good answer. Sammy.
That's a God. I'm being influenced so heavily by what I'm experiencing right now. I would say bring people together right now. And as a leader, understand that you either build or destroy with every word that you speak from the podium.
So I would say talk to the Muslims, not about the Muslims. And our children are watching. Celebrate us, edify us, communicate with us. Because I think together, the American Muslims, especially the Americans who are Muslims, we are contributing so phenomenally and not recognized by the current government. So talk to us, not about us.
Katarina.
I think repeat what you said. This message of like unity is something that's like definitely evidence-based advice, that it's related to lower extremism and greater like tolerance and openness.
Avoiding division.
Yes.
Is there a specific policy or just the actual message?
That was the message.
Okay, Omar. Policy, attitude, speech. What
Yeah,
should we
so
do?
I was actually going to say rhetoric and policy have to go hand in hand. So it would, having nice rhetoric about the Muslim, it would be nice to not be told that we're evil and that,
Dancing on 9/11.
Yeah, it would be nice to be. Yeah, I mean, he didn't even specify what type of dance. It could have been a dubka, it could have been all. But, policy and rhetoric have to go hand in hand. So extending a hand of friendship to the Muslim community, both here and abroad, should not just be affirming through language that Islam is a religion of peace, but also not bombing the Muslim world and not divisive policy that will only further create hate groups and terror.
Okay. Daisy?
So I have two messages. One is to my fellow Americans, which is that we need to permanently de-link the religion of Islam from the actions of terrorists. No more linking of the two, right? And then we only have one president of the United States. So I would say, Mr. President, are you listening? Wherever you are wealthy, and you claim to be worldly. It's time for you to get wise.
A nice, both wise words and a good plug for your organization and book. We're going to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to words of wisdom from this panel. Give them a big round of applause and words of hope.